It always happens in the quiet. Not when you are still checking your phone every 10 minutes. Not when your chest is still tight with hope. Not when your mind is still building little fantasies out of nothing. It happens later. After the anger has burned down, after the tears have dried into that strange emotional numbness, after you have finally stopped expecting their name to appear. That is when it comes. A message, a reaction, a hey, a casual little knock from the ghost who once made your nervous system feel like home and danger at the same time. And suddenly, months of silence collapse into 1 second. Your stomach drops, your breath changes, your brain starts racing for meaning. Why now? Why after all this time? Why after disappearing like you meant nothing? And the most painful part is not even the message itself, it is what it awakens. Because somewhere deep inside you, there is still a part that wants to believe this means something sacred, something fated, something unfinished. You want to believe they came back because they finally realized your worth, because they could not forget you, because love won. But the truth is darker than that, and strangely, more human. Avoidants do not always come back because they are clear. They often come back because they are conflicted. They do not reach out when they have become emotionally brave. They often reach out when distance has made the connection feel safe again. That is the hidden reason people miss. You think their silence meant they did not care enough. But very often, silence was not the absence of feeling, it was the overload of feeling. That is what makes this dynamic so devastating. You were sitting there translating distance as indifference, while they were experiencing closeness as pressure. You were trying to move toward connection to feel secure. They were moving away from connection to feel in control. Same bond, opposite nervous systems, opposite survival strategies. And if you do not understand that, you will keep personalizing their behavior in a way that destroys your self-worth. Because the brutal truth is this: when you chased answers, when you asked for clarity, when you wanted reassurance, you were not just asking for love. In their body, it often registered as demand, as engulfment, as expectation, as emotional intensity they did not know how to metabolize, so they withdrew. Not always because they stopped caring. Sometimes because caring activated too much guilt, too much vulnerability, too much responsibility, too much exposure. To love someone when you are avoidant can feel less like warmth and more like losing oxygen. That does not make the silence fair. It does not make the disappearance kind. It does not excuse the confusion they caused, but it changes the story. Because the story you have been telling yourself is that if you had mattered more, they would have stayed consistent. If you had been softer, prettier, calmer, less emotional, less needy, less honest, less real, then maybe they would not have pulled away. No. The deeper reality is that intimacy itself may have been the trigger. Your presence got close enough to touch the places they spend their whole life defending. And that is why they vanish, then reappear. Not because they are playing chess while you are playing checkers. Not because they hold all the power. Not because they forgot you and then suddenly remembered. But because avoidance has a rhythm. Distance calms them down. Distance lowers the emotional volume. Distance gives them access to feelings they could not process in real time. When you were right there, with your needs, your love, your eyes, your tenderness, your disappointment, your hope, their nervous system could interpret it as pressure. The amygdala, that old alarm center in the brain, does not care whether something is beautiful. It only cares whether something feels threatening. And intimacy, for an avoidant nervous system, can feel like a threat to autonomy. A threat to control, a threat to the carefully managed emotional distance that keeps them functional. So cortisol rises, their body tightens, their mind starts looking for escape routes. They become cold in places where they once sounded warm. Not because the bond was fake, because the bond became overwhelming. Then they leave. And here is the part no one tells you. Once the relationship is no longer immediate, once your emotions are no longer in front of them, once your disappointment is no longer visible, once the pressure to respond, explain, commit, or regulate somebody else's feelings fades, Their nervous system begins to settle. The threat goes down. The memory comes up. Now the dopamine has room to speak. Now nostalgia can enter. Now curiosity returns. Now they can miss you without feeling consumed by you. Do you understand how painful that is? They can feel you more clearly when you are gone. So months later, when you have started rebuilding yourself in the dark, when you have finally begun separating your identity from their inconsistency, they reach out. And from your side, it looks almost cruel. Because you think, if they missed me, why didn't they say so then? Because then, the feeling and the fear were tangled together. Now the fear is quieter. That is the hidden reason. Not always manipulation. Not always clarity. Not always love either. Overwhelm. This is why so many avoidants resurface in seasons rather than in commitment. They return in fragments, in soft check-ins, in delayed vulnerability, in little emotional drips that let them touch the connection without drowning in it. They miss you in doses. They approach you in doses. They want relief without full exposure. And if you do not see that clearly, you will mistake a moment of emotional availability for transformation. That is where people get trapped. Because when the message comes, your wounded self does not read it neutrally. It reads it like resurrection. It says, "Finally, see? I was not crazy. They did care." And that validation can feel so intoxicating that you ignore the deeper question. Has anything actually changed? Not their words, not the timing, not the chemistry. Changed. Because attention is not change. Missing you is not change. Reaching out is not change. Even crying is not change. Real change is the ability to stay emotionally present when closeness returns. That is the test. Anyone can miss you from a distance. Very few people know how to love you up close. Let that land. An avoidant can genuinely think about you for months. They can replay your last conversation in their mind while driving home at night. They can stare at your profile and say nothing. They can compare everyone new to the way you made them feel. They can wonder whether you hate them. They can feel guilt in random waves. They can remember the softness of your voice at 2 a.m. They can miss your loyalty, your body, your patience, your safety, your understanding, and still not be ready to love you well. This is the contradiction that breaks people. Because your heart thinks feeling should lead to action. But unhealed attachment does not work like that. Feeling often leads to avoidance. Missing leads to hesitation. Longing leads to a text, not a plan. Regret leads to contact, not consistency. You see the opening and imagine a doorway. Sometimes it is just a window. Picture them alone one night. The world is quiet. Their distractions are not working the way they usually do. The conversations with other people feel thin. The freedom they fought for suddenly tastes a little empty. There is no pressure in the room now. No hard talk waiting. No emotional mirror reflecting their limitations back to them. Just memory. And memory is selective. Memory pulls out your warmth, your scent, the way you understood things they never had to explain. Memory softens conflict and highlights comfort. Memory lets them access the reward of connection without the immediate cost of intimacy. So they pick up the phone, not because they solved themselves, because silence made you safe to want again. That is why the core concept here is silence. Not your silence as a tactic, not strategic silence, sacred silence. The silence after you stop performing pain for someone who only knows how to approach you when you are no longer emotionally reaching. The silence where you stop trying to explain your value to a nervous system organized around distance. The silence where you let their confusion belong to them. That silence changes the whole dynamic. Because when you stop reacting, stop chasing, stop sending energy toward the closed door, something unsettling happens in them. The emotional field changes. The role you played in regulating their sense of importance disappears. The certainty that you will always be there begins to crack. The person they could keep on a shelf suddenly becomes unavailable in the way they made you feel unavailable. and now they feel it. Not because you manipulated them, because your absence finally became real. Before that, even during no contact, many avoidants still assume access. They assume they can return whenever they are ready, whenever they are lonely, whenever their fear calms down enough to risk a message. Part of them believes the bond is paused, not lost. But when your silence becomes embodied, when it is not just no texting, but actual emotional withdrawal, when you are no longer orbiting them in your mind every day, when your energy stops bending toward their return, they begin to experience something they spent the whole relationship avoiding: loss. And loss is clarifying. That is when they start checking, start wondering, start revisiting, start reaching. Sometimes softly, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes like nothing happened. "Hey stranger, been thinking about you. How have you been? I saw something that reminded me of you." Small messages carrying large hunger. Because now you are no longer pressing against them, you are receding. And for a person whose system only knows how to feel safe in distance, your distance becomes magnetic. Not because they are evil, because humans often feel what they cannot fully possess more intensely than what is right in front of them. This is the flip people talk about, but they often talk about it too shallowly. It is not just that they come back because you ignored them. It is that your non-reactivity removes the dance that once protected them from their own feelings. When you chased, they could stay defended. When you pleaded, they could stay superior. When you explained, they could stay detached. When you made them the center, they did not have to confront the emptiness of losing you. But when you go quiet for real, not as performance but as release, the structure collapses. Now there is no one feeding the old pattern. Now there is space for their own unmet feelings to echo back. Now they hear themselves, and that is often when obsession begins. Not always dramatic obsession, sometimes subtle obsession. They think about whether you are seeing someone else. They wonder if you talk about them. They imagine you healed. They stalk and do not speak. They open the chat and close it. They replay your last reply, looking for whether the door is still open. They feel the sting of your indifference before you have even become indifferent. And here is the part you need to hear with your whole body. Their return does not automatically mean your past pain has been redeemed. Do not let delayed attention become proof of destiny. Because the same nervous system that missed you in your absence may panic again in your presence. That is the pattern. This is why so many people get rehooked. The avoidant comes back, softer, warmer, more expressive than before. There is vulnerability, there is relief, there is chemistry. There is that intoxicating sense that now, finally, the walls are down. And for a brief window, it feels true, because in that moment, it is true. They do feel open, they do feel the loss, they do feel tenderness. But then closeness builds again. Expectation returns. Emotional responsibility rises. The old alarm goes off, and the cycle begins again. This is your warning. If you confuse access with safety, you will reopen a wound that took you months to survive. So if they come back, do not only ask whether they missed you, ask whether they can remain when intimacy gets uncomfortable. Can they communicate when they feel overwhelmed? Can they stay in the room when guilt, shame, or fear gets activated? Can they name their inner world instead of disappearing into it? Can they offer consistency, not just chemistry? Can they tolerate your humanity without shutting down? Can they hold connection without treating it like captivity? If the answer is no, their return is not a reunion, it is a repetition. And you are not here to be chosen in fragments. That is the deepest shift. Because the old version of you heard from them months later and thought, "This means I mattered." The healed version of you hears from them and thinks, "Of course I mattered. That was never the question." The question is whether they can meet you where you now stand. That is power. Not pretending you do not care, not playing hard to get, not becoming cold because they were cold. Power is no longer negotiating against your own nervous system just to keep someone emotionally half present. Power is being able to feel the pull without obeying it, to feel the history without becoming trapped inside it, to recognize that someone can miss you deeply and still be unfit to love you properly. That is a hard truth. But it sets people free. Because once you understand the hidden reason avoidants reach out months later, you stop romanticizing the delay. You stop turning their confusion into your fairy tale. You stop seeing their return as the finish line. You see it for what it is. Information. Evidence that your absence registered. Evidence that the bond was real. Evidence that they are human, conflicted, affected. But not evidence that you should abandon yourself. And maybe that is the transformation you were actually meant to have. Not learning how to get them back. Learning how to no longer leave yourself behind whenever they return. Read that again in your soul. Because self-worth is not measured by who comes back. Self-worth is measured by what you permit once they do. You are not powerful because they miss you now. You are powerful because you survived being missed too late. You are powerful because their silence did not get the final word on your value. You are powerful because you can understand their psychology without making it your prison. You are powerful because you can have compassion for their overwhelm and still refuse to volunteer for another round of emotional starvation. That is what independence looks like. Not bitterness, discernment. Not closing your heart, protecting its standards. Not proving you are unforgettable. Realizing you were never replaceable to begin with. So if they reach out months later, breathe before you answer. Feel your body before you follow the old script. Let the part of you that once begged for crumbs stay seated. Let the woman, the man, the self you became in the silence speak first. You do not need to rush. You do not need to decode every word. You do not need to turn one message into a future. You only need to remember who you are now. Someone who no longer mistakes delayed desire for devotion. Someone who no longer confuses being wanted with being safe. Someone who knows that love without emotional courage will always collapse under its own weight. And someone who finally understands this. They may come back because they were overwhelmed, because distance made their feelings accessible, because silence forced them to confront your absence, because your non-reactivity made them feel what you're chasing once concealed. But whether they stay, whether they grow, whether they can love without retreating into fear, that is their work. Your work is simpler, harder, holier. Do not abandon yourself just because someone finally found the nerve to text you back from the ruins. You are not the place people visit when loneliness softens them. You are not a shelter for the emotionally undecided. You are not a mirror for someone who only wants to see themselves when they are ready. You are a living boundary, a living standard, a living reminder that love must be able to remain. And if they cannot remain, let their return teach you something greater than hope. Let it teach you your value was never hidden from them. It was hidden from you. Until now.